Well, hi there, I'm Noah Bradley, and this is Handmade House TV. On this week's episode, I'm going to show you how I undertake the challenge of doing the trickiest board there is in the construction of a log cabin. So stay tuned. Well, here we are at the lake site where the little log cabin is going back up, and I wanted to share with you guys one of the things that perhaps I need more embellishment, more detail with regard to the questions I've gotten since the Log Cabin Academy was released. And one of them is in the wherever one structure meets the log cabin, and how to make that come about, how to do a really nice job on that. Whether or not that might be a frame addition that comes off of our log cabin, or whether or not it's a post and beam addition, whether or not we are using lap siding or we're using board and batten siding, how best to merge that special point where the two structures come together to make it as attractive as possible and also as maintenance free, as rot free, as protecting our structure and making it as good as it can be. So I want to start at the corner there. And since I'm going to be taking material off of it, there's generally several fits, several cuts. You mark it well, you do your best, you think you're going to hit a home run, but it never fails. You have to come back and cut off a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And as you're cutting off more and more, scribe fitting it, trying to improve and refine that fit to the level that you want to get it to, that you're making the board narrower and narrower. So you don't want to test fit it and think that you're going to get it right the first time, and then it starts to shrink to way to nothing. So you really want to start over in the corner. And when you start with the board, you want to start with one of the widest you can. If you're doing board and batten, pick the widest board, the nicest board, the straightest board you have to work with, and because you know you're going to be making it narrower as you work on it. And if you're doing board and batten, if you're doing lap siding and you're doing corner boards, and say you're in the corners, you're putting 4-inch wide corners in the corners, and I would not start with a 4-inch over here to scribe fit. I would probably start with an 8-inch, and then take care of your scribe fit. And then if you find you got a little bit too much wood on it, you can always go ahead and put it in a table saw and rip a little bit off of it. But you always want to work with the best wood you can. You always want to start with your scribe fit. And so then the first step you want to do is you want to cut this board to the proper length. The next thing you want to do is you want to go ahead and temporarily put the board in place. You want to screw and or nail it up right next to where you're going to do the scribe fitting. And you want to make sure that this board is put in plumb, straight up and down. You want it to be exactly right. If you're working with a log cabin, you're going to find that your logs might very well be a little bit out of plumb. If you're doing restoration work of a vintage log cabin, you'll be surprised if it won't be out of plumb. But you really want to try to get this board as plumb as what you possibly can. Now, one diagonal to that thought is that frequently when I work with log cabins that are way out of plumb, and that I will sometimes do a technique, what is known as splitting the difference, and that is that if the log walls are way out of plumb, as much as several inches from the top to the bottom, and we're doing an addition that is plumb, that scribe board might look a little. It might be pointing out how flawed the cabin is. And so if you take this trim board and you just consider the option of, instead of making it plumb, or instead of making it run exactly out of plumb as the house is, if you split that difference halfway in between the two, you probably won't notice that the board is a little bit out of plumb, and it won't be so blaringly obvious that the log cabin is out of plumb. So that's known as splitting the difference, and it's a technique I use often. So now that we have this board temporarily tacked plumb against the logs as close over as what we can, the next step to do is to go ahead and scribe fit it. I do this using just an old school compass with a pencil in it, and I set the dimensions so that they are at the widest point possible, and then I carefully try to make sure and keep this thing horizontal, perfectly horizontal as I go up and down the board. Sometimes, in order to ensure that I am holding it horizontal, I'll make a few marks, particularly at that critical edge of the logs, to point out to me, are you being horizontal with this scribe fit? If you're not holding it perfectly horizontal, then you're not transferring the marks over as well as what you should be doing. And so you're going to end up with a less than pleasing result in the end. Now, one thing that's heartbreaking about doing a good scribe fit when you're using rough sawn material on the outside of your house is the idea of doing this meticulous scribe job of getting it just right and nailing it up in place, and then you come back a week or two later and the sun has hit the siding and your trim board has shrunk up, and there's a nice consistent gap running from top to bottom, which means that you need to pull the board off and put it back against the side. You really don't want to come in and with some kind of tacky, ugly caulk job. You've gone to such trouble to do this beautiful scribe fit. You want to go ahead and make it right. So typically when I go ahead and I create the scribe fit, I'll temporarily tack the board up in place and I'll let it dry. I'll let it season with the building for a week or two. Make sure it's done its thing. And then I'll go ahead and I'll flush it over, I'll drive it over as tight as I can to the log cabin, and I'm done with it. I'm pleased with it. Now, one final thing before we go, I'd like to make a point, and that is that with regard to chinking, and that is that when we're chinking, I've always emphasized that the last thing you do on the outside of your log cabin is to chink it. Once you've finished everything else, you chink it. That includes the scribe board. You always want to make sure and get your window and door trim up, plus this scribe joint. The scribe joint goes into your chink joint, and when you apply your cement chinking, when you're smearing it on, it'll go right up against this board, and it'll give you a really sweet finished result in the end. Well, okay, that's it. Thank you guys once again. I think that this key ingredient will help you greatly in the construction of your log home. Stay tuned for the coming episodes. We're going to start talking about slate, about how you can acquire the best type of slate at the best price, and what tools you need to install it, and how to install it. Step by step, we'll go through the process of putting slate on our tiny log cabin here. So we'll see you then. Thank you much now. Bye.